The signal you are about to hear was logged at 9:17 and 14 seconds. Our transmitter at Bolinas did not send the message it acknowledges until 9:17 and 22 seconds. I checked both clocks myself. 8 seconds may not sound like much, but across a radio circuit, an answer cannot arrive before the question. Not from a ship, not from a coast station, not from anywhere. This is Elias Van, at the Point Reyes receiving site of historic station KPH. The date on this recording is July 12th. The time is 11:43 Pacific. This is not an official station bulletin. It is not part of the Night of Nights program, and it is not intended for transmission. I am recording it on the maintenance deck because the digital logging system has begun changing entries after they are written. Paper has not. At least, not quickly. I have placed the original paper tape, the receiver log, the remote keying record from Bolinas, and the mechanical clock photograph on the desk in front of me. The doors are locked. The primary receivers are disconnected. The antenna selector is grounded. The remote keying circuit to Bolinas shows open. Nothing in this building should currently be capable of receiving or transmitting a radio signal. The monitor beside me is still producing Morse. It is not connected to a receiver. I will come back to that. First, I need to explain what this station is, what happened tonight, and why the call sign MBXQ must not be answered if it appears again. KPH is an old maritime coast station. For much of the last century, stations like this were the shoreward end of a network that stretched across the oceans. Ships carried radio officers, coast stations watched calling frequencies, handled telegrams and weather traffic, and listened for vessels that could not reach anyone else. Before satellite terminals, before reliable oceanic telephone service, before a ship could send its position through a computer with one button, there was a receiver, a key, and an operator who knew how to hear weak Morse through atmospheric noise. The arrangement here is unusual to people who only know modern radio. The receiving station is at Point Reyes. The transmitters are farther south at Bolinas. They were separated because a powerful transmitter beside a sensitive receiver would make it nearly impossible to hear weak ships at sea. An operator at Point Reyes could listen here and remotely key the transmitters at Bolinas over a control line. One site heard. The other spoke. That separation matters. Tonight, for 11 minutes and 40 seconds, Point Reyes heard a transmission that Bolinas had not yet made. Every July 12, the old maritime frequencies return to life for Night of Nights. The event commemorates the end of commercial Morse operations in the United States and honors the operators who kept watch over ships for generations. The opening message goes out shortly after 5 in the afternoon. The old equipment warms. Relays move again. Call signs that once crossed entire oceans appear in the headphones. For several hours, the building sounds less like a museum and more like what it was built to be. There is nothing supernatural about that. The equipment is old, not haunted. The sounds people sometimes describe as voices are usually intermodulation, nearby broadcasts, electrical noise, or a human brain trying to turn random rhythm into language. The signal tonight was none of those things. It was clean, continuous wave Morse, sent at 22 words per minute with a stable carrier and a hand-keyed rhythm. Not machine perfect. Human. Or close enough to human that I believed it was an operator for the first 23 minutes. At 8:56, most of the scheduled work had ended. I remained at the operating position to complete the receiver log and monitor one restored working channel until the final sign-off. The room was quiet. The west windows were black. Fog had erased the last light over the Pacific, and the cypress branches along the road were moving just enough to brush one another. The primary receiver was tuned correctly. The signal level was low. Atmospheric noise came in slow waves, ordinary for a coastal summer night. At 9:02, I heard 3 incomplete characters below the noise. I did not log them. A weak signal can suggest almost anything when only part of each letter rises above static. At 9:04, the same three characters returned: M, B, X. The fourth character was lost. At 9:06, the carrier returned at a stronger level and sent the full identification twice: MBXQ. Then it called KPH. KPH, KPH, DMBXQ. That is the only time in this recording I will reproduce the full call exactly. If you are monitoring and hear MBXQ, do not acknowledge it. Do not send a question mark. Do not repeat its call sign to confirm reception. Do not allow an automatic decoder to respond. Remove audio from the decoder input and record the carrier only. Do not give it sequence. At 9:06, I did not know that. I treated it as an unscheduled station attempting contact during a commemorative event. Historic calls are occasionally used by museums, preserved vessels, or licensed operators participating in special transmissions. I assumed MBXQ belonged to one of them. I checked the event list. It was not there. I checked the current Maritime database available at the position. There was no exact match. That did not immediately concern me. Call sign records change. An operator can send badly. A weak B can sound like a D. An X can lose one element and become another character. I copied it 3 times. Each transmission was identical. MBXQ. Its timing was distinctive. The operator held the space after the second character slightly too long and compressed the final 2. It was the kind of fist an experienced radio telegraph operator could recognize after hearing only a few lines. I sent the standard request for identification and traffic. The Bolinas transmitter keyed normally. The control indicator lit. The outgoing carrier appeared on the separate monitor. The remote transmission record marked the beginning and end of every character. MBXQ answered with a service abbreviation indicating one message waiting. The signal was now stronger. That should have helped. Instead, the answer introduced the first contradiction. The station sent a 6-character service group before I requested it. It appeared meaningless. J4N7LC. I copied the group and wrote a question mark beside it. 9 seconds later, following normal procedure, I transmitted a request to repeat the service group. MBXQ replied immediately. The repeated group was J4N7LC. Then it sent my request back to me character for character. Not an acknowledgement of the request itself. I assumed receiver feedback. A remote coast station can create confusing echoes when an outgoing signal is picked up by another receiver and returned through a linked circuit. Under unusual propagation conditions, a signal can also travel by more than one path and arrive as a delayed echo. But this was not an echo. The rhythm was different. My request had been sent by the automatic keyer at a fixed speed. The returning version had the uneven spacing of MBXQ's operator. It was as if someone had listened to the automatic transmission and copied it by hand. That was still possible. Unusual, but possible. I logged the return as deliberate repetition and requested the vessel's name, position, and destination. The reply came after a long carrier pause. No vessel name. No ordinary position. Only 3 number groups. I read them first as a date, a time, and a distance. July 12, 1999, 0001 UTC, 81840. The first 2 groups were familiar. July 12, 1999 was the date associated with the end of commercial maritime Morse in the United States and the beginning of the preservation effort that returned these stations to the air. 0001 UTC is 1 minute after midnight, the traditional opening moment in Greenwich time for Night of Nights. The third group meant nothing to me. I asked for clarification. Before the transmitter indicator came on, MBXQ sent a question mark. Then it repeated my clarification request. At the time, I believe the question mark began after my keyer started. The exchange was quick, and the audio recorder did not display timing down to fractions of a second. I did not yet understand that the reply had started first. At 9:11, I checked the signal on a second receiver. Same frequency, same carrier, same call. I routed the antenna through a different preselector and narrowed the filter. The signal remained. I disconnected the first receiver from the audio system. The signal remained on the second. I switched to a reserve antenna several hundred feet away. The carrier weakened by 2 units but remained readable. That told me it was arriving through the antenna system rather than being generated entirely inside the operations room. I rotated through the directional arrays available from the position. The strongest response came from the west-southwest. The weakest came when the array null faced the same direction. On an ordinary night, that would suggest a source somewhere across the Pacific. It did not provide distance. HF direction finding is not a ruler. A signal can arrive after one ionospheric reflection or several. It can circle a large fraction of the planet under the right conditions. A nearby transmitter can also appear to arrive from the wrong direction if the signal is reflected. But it provided a starting point. West-southwest. Open ocean. I sent a signal report and asked MBXQ to identify its coast of registry. The station answered with J4N7LC again. This time, it added 6 digits. I wrote them beneath the first group. At 9:12, I assumed 091722 was another reference number. 5 minutes later, it became the most important number in the room. At 9:13, I searched the paper call sign archive. The station maintains historical material from different periods. Most of it is not organized for rapid identification. Some cards list vessels, others list coast stations, traffic routes, frequency assignments, or old operating practices. I checked M, then B, then the combined MB block. No MBXQ. I checked possible copying errors. MBDQ, MBRQ, MDXQ. Nothing matched the signal, and nothing matched the unusual hand-keyed spacing. While I searched, MBXQ continued calling KPH every 42 seconds. The interval was exact. The keying was not. Every call had the same human irregularity, but the calls began 42 seconds apart to within the resolution of the recorder. That combination is difficult to produce accidentally. It was as though the operator was manually sending from inside an automated schedule. At 9:15, I found a card for a British cargo vessel called Bellwether. The card was filed under BE, not under its call sign. The vessel name was typed in faded black. Gross tonnage, owner, primary route, and radio equipment were listed below it. The call sign field was blank. A handwritten notation had been added at the bottom. 4 characters. MBXQ. I did not take the card seriously at first. Historical records contain corrections. Operators wrote in margins. Call signs changed with ownership or national registration. A handwritten addition is not unusual. What was unusual was the pencil. The mark was dark, sharp, and free of the oxidation visible in older graphite notes on nearby cards. It looked recent. I rubbed the blank edge of the card with my thumb. Dust came away. When I touched the handwritten call, graphite marked my skin. Someone had written MBXQ recently enough for loose material to remain. I am the person responsible for that drawer. It had not been opened since the previous month. No visitors handled those cards tonight. I photographed the card and returned to the operating position. The carrier was still present. The call interval had changed. 33 seconds. I checked the last 4 calls. 42 seconds. 42. 33. 33. The interval had shortened by 9 seconds. I sent no acknowledgement. MBXQ sent J4N7LC. followed by 091722. Then it sent my station identifier and a short procedural command. It asked KPH to repeat the last transmission. I had not transmitted for nearly 4 minutes. At 9:16, I began testing for a clock or recording error. There were 4 relevant time sources in the building: the digital network clock, the mechanical operations clock, the timestamp unit connected to the paper printer, and my own battery-powered watch, which had not been connected to station power or network timing. The network clock and operations clock differed by less than 1 second. The printer lagged by approximately 2/10. My watch was slightly over 1 second fast. None differed by 8 seconds. None was changing unexpectedly. I checked the audio recorder against a known minute marker. Correct. I checked the remote keying log from Bolinas. Correct. I then played the previous exchange on separate channels. The left channel contained received audio. The right contained the remote keying reference sent to Bolinas. I aligned them at 9:17. The received signal sent J4N7LC and 091722. It stopped. 8.4 seconds later, the remote keying channel began transmitting my request for MBXQ to repeat its last service group. The ship's signal resumed before my request ended. It repeated the request I was still sending. Then it acknowledged it. The number 091722 was not a reference number. It was a time. 9:17 and 22 seconds. The exact second when the Bolinas transmitter began sending the message MBXQ had already answered. There are ways to create that result artificially. A logging computer can assign incorrect timestamps. 2 recorders can drift. A playback channel can be mislabeled. A delayed local recording can be mistaken for a live signal. A person with access to the station schedule can transmit a prepared response at the correct moment. I considered each explanation. The problem was not that none could produce an apparent negative delay. The problem was that all 4 independent records showed the same order. Received signal first. Bolinas transmission second. The paper printer had stamped MBXQ's reply at 9:17:14. The remote transmitter controller recorded my message at 9:17:22. The mechanical operations clock was visible in the room camera. The second hand crossed 14 when the receiver indicator moved. It crossed 22 when the transmitter indicator lit. 8.4 seconds. The answer arrived before the question. At 9:19, I made the mistake that completed the second part of the exchange. I decided to test whether the sender had access to station automation or was simply anticipating standard procedure. Instead of using a normal service group, I selected 6 random characters. I did not type them into the logging computer. I did not write them on the message form. I placed my left hand over the blank section of paper and marked 1 character at a time beneath it, so the room camera could not see. N, Q, 7, L, 4, X. NQ7L4X. There was no predictable meaning. It was not a standard group. It had never been transmitted by this station. I set the automatic keyer but did not press send. MBXQ's carrier appeared. It transmitted NQ7L4X. Then it transmitted 091936. I looked at the station clock. The time was 9:19 and 27 seconds. I waited. At 9:19 and 36 seconds, without consciously deciding to do it, I pressed send. The Bolinas transmitter sent NQ7L4X. I need to be precise here. No equipment forced my hand. The button did not activate itself. I pressed it because I was watching the clock and because some part of me needed to know whether the number would be correct. That choice was mine. But the signal had recorded the time of my choice 9 seconds before I made it. MBXQ acknowledged the group. The interval between its calls shortened again, 24 seconds. The negative delay on the next exchange was 16.8 seconds, exactly twice the first measured delay. I stopped transmitting. At 9:22, I wrote 3 possible explanations in the paper log. The first was deliberate interference combined with compromised station records. The second was an unknown feedback path between Point Reyes and Bolinas. The third was equipment failure. I did not write a fourth. I did not write time anomaly. I did not write impossible. Those words do not help when equipment behaves unexpectedly. You isolate circuits. You compare instruments. You reduce the system until the fault either disappears or becomes measurable. I began with the automatic keyer. I removed it from the control line. MBXQ continued. I disconnected the remote keying audio reference. MBXQ continued. I disabled the logging computer's decoder. The characters disappeared from the screen, but the carrier remained audible. I changed frequency by 2 kilohertz. The signal vanished. I returned. It was waiting, not calling, waiting on a steady carrier. When I settled exactly on frequency, it sent 1 character, K. The Morse letter K is commonly used as an invitation to transmit. I did not answer. After 24 seconds, it sent K again. Then, it sent J4N7LC. At 9:24, I recognized the service group, not from current procedure, from an old punched tape stored with the station's automatic transmission material. Repeated announcements, identifiers, and scheduled bulletins could be prepared in advance. Some operators referred to repeated material as wheels because the message could cycle through again and again. J4N7LC was not the text of a message. It was a routing label written on the leader of an old tape. I had seen it earlier that week while checking the storage cabinet. The tape itself carried a closing transmission used during one of the earliest commemorative operations. The label meant July 12th, night circuit, closing message. The characters had no reason to exist on the air. They were an internal station reference. MBXQ was not repeating something transmitted in 1999. It was reading a label that had never been sent. I opened the tape cabinet. The reel was missing. I checked the maintenance deck. Nothing. I checked the automatic keying position. No tape was loaded. The empty storage hook was visible beneath its handwritten number. I returned to the archive card for SS Bellwether. The card had changed. I understand how that sounds. I had photographed it. The photograph showed the vessel name, technical information, and handwritten call sign. The physical card now contained an additional line. Last heard KPH 12 July 1999. The line was in the same fresh graphite. Below it was a position, 38.095940 north, 122.947430 west. Those coordinates do not mark a place at sea. They mark this receiving station. More precisely, they mark the grounds of this facility at Point Reyes. I checked the photograph again. The line was not present in the image taken 9 minutes earlier. I placed the card under the room camera and started a continuous recording. At 9:27, I examined the remaining vessel information. SS Bellwether was described as a general cargo vessel built in the late 1920s. The listed route passed between the Pacific Northwest, California, Hawaii, and ports in East Asia. The owner field was abbreviated. The registration number did not match the formatting used in surrounding cards. There was no loss date, no casualty notation, no transfer, no scrapping record. The vessel simply ended at the bottom of the card. I searched the digitized archive again. No Bellwether. I searched shipping references available locally. No exact vessel matching the card's details. This is important. I did not discover a famous lost ship. There was no documented sinking. There was no final SOS. There was no crew list waiting to be uncovered. The only evidence that SS Bellwether had ever existed was a card that had begun adding information while I watched. At 9:29, MBXQ sent 3 new groups. At first, they resembled dates: July 26, 2028, 1 minute after midnight, July 27, 2027, but the order made no sense. I recorded them without answering. The signal repeated the groups. The call interval shortened from 24 seconds to 15. The negative delay could no longer be measured because I had stopped transmitting. The carrier strength increased. On the directional array, it still peaked west-southwest. The signal had risen by almost 4 units without significant change in atmospheric noise. That can happen. Propagation can improve quickly. A distant transmitter can grow stronger as ionospheric conditions shift. But a stronger signal does not necessarily mean a source is physically approaching. I reminded myself of that several times. At 9:31, the frequency drift meter showed the carrier moving upward by less than 1 Hertz per minute. That was extremely stable for an old ship transmitter, but not impossible for modern equipment. Then the drift reversed. It returned precisely to the frequency at which I had first heard it. Not approximately. Precisely. The carrier was correcting itself against my receiver. I changed the receiver reference slightly. MBXQ followed. I restored the reference. It followed back. This meant either the transmitter could observe the frequency error at my receiver in real time, or the carrier was not independent of the receiving system. I connected a third receiver using a separate frequency standard. The signal appeared at a slightly different offset on each set. A real external carrier should have one frequency. 2 correctly functioning receivers might display it differently due to calibration error, but the signal itself cannot adjust separately for each. MBXQ did. In the left receiver, it centered itself. In the right receiver, it also centered itself, even though the 2 passbands were offset. I listened to both through separate headphones. The Morse arrived simultaneously. The sound was not identical. On the first receiver, the operator's spacing was uneven. On the second, the spacing matched my own keying rhythm. I removed the right headphone. I did not want to hear it improve. At 9:33, the paper printer activated. The decoder had been disabled 11 minutes earlier. The data line was unplugged. The printer produced 1 row of characters anyway. 38.095940, 122.947430, then .03, the coordinates of the receiving site. Waypoint 3. That was the first moment I stopped thinking of the number groups as messages. They were positions, but not the positions of a vessel moving through water. They were points in a route. The 1999 date and opening time formed the first point. My 9/17/22 transmission formed another. The current receiving site formed the third. The path used dates, transmission moments, and radio locations interchangeably. A ship's position is normally expressed in space. MBXQ's position required space and time. At 9:35, I compared the earlier groups. The third group, 081840, separated cleanly as 081840. I searched the station's preserved recordings from July 12, 1999. At 001 UTC, the commemorative circuit opened. At 081840 UTC, the archived closing material ended. The groups described a complete transmission window, opening to sign-off. The next group set corresponded to later night of nights dates, although the order appeared wrong when read as a calendar. When arranged by transmission duration rather than year, they formed a sequence from shortest operating window to longest. Every annual return of the station had extended the route. The first event opened it. Each later event added distance. Tonight's broadcast had not created the anomaly. It had resumed work left unfinished 27 years earlier. I found the old closing tape inventory. The missing reel marked J4N7LC contained the final sign-off from the first route point. The tape had not been stolen. At 9:37, I found it rotating on the maintenance deck behind me. I had checked that machine minutes earlier. It was empty. The power switch was off. Now the supply reel held a loop of brown tape. The take-up reel was turning. The counter moved backward. There was no power indicator. I pulled the plug from the wall. The reel continued for 4 seconds, slowed and stopped. The counter showed 091714, the time of MBXQ's first verified reply. I removed the tape. There was no leader label and no obvious splice. I placed it in a metal can and set the can beneath the operations desk. The receiver carrier dropped immediately. For the first time since 9:06, the frequency went silent. Not faded, not weakened, silent. I waited 3 minutes. No call, no carrier. The printer remained still. I checked the disconnected keying circuits. I photographed the archive card again. No new writing appeared. At 9:41, I believed the event had stabilized. My working explanation was that the old tape, or its magnetic content, had entered the audio system through an unknown coupling path. It did not explain the live carrier, directional behavior, changing archive, or negative delay. But it gave me an object associated with the effect. Remove the object. Effect stops. That is the beginning of containment, even when the mechanism is unclear. I grounded the active antenna input. I opened the main receiver breaker. The room became quiet enough to hear fog moisture collecting in the gutter outside. I did not transmit again. I did not speak. The call had ended. Then the metal can beneath the desk clicked. 1 click. Pause. 2 short clicks. Pause. 1 long. The lid was moving, not opening. Flexing inward and outward as though pressure inside the sealed can were tapping Morse against the metal. I placed a microphone near it. The sequence repeated. KPH. The can tapped the station call sign 3 times. I carried it to the center of the operations room and set it on the floor away from every cable. The tapping stopped. The paper printer began. It did not print characters because its data connection remained unplugged. The print head moved without paper advance. Left, right, left, pause. I listened to the mechanical rhythm. KPH DMBXQ. The signal no longer required radio. That conclusion may be slightly wrong. I no longer believe radio was the source of the anomaly. Radio was its first usable structure. Morse divides information into time. A signal exists or does not exist. Long, short, space, sequence. A location can be ambiguous. A sound can be distorted. A voice can be misunderstood. But timing is enough to reconstruct a character. MBXQ did not need the receiver once it had established the timing pattern inside the station. The tape lid, printer solenoids, relay armatures, and even the slight changes in transformer hum could all produce the same intervals. The station had stopped receiving Morse. The building had learned how to become Morse. At 9:45, I disconnected the printer breaker. The printhead completed the character it was forming before it lost power. K. Invitation to transmit. I refused. I sat at the desk and listened. No more clicks. The receiver racks were dark. The room camera continued recording on battery backup. The mechanical clock passed 9:46. Then 9:47. At 9:48, I saw movement on the archive card under the camera. A graphite line appeared without a pencil. It began as a small point beneath the coordinates. The point dragged itself across the card. Slowly. The sound was faint but audible through the camera microphone. It wrote, .04. Below that, KPH operator. Below that, my initials, EV. I had not entered my name into the radio log. My initials were present on maintenance forms and archive labels throughout the building. The anomaly did not need private knowledge to find them. That was what I told myself. Then the card wrote 6 characters. NQ7L4X. My random test group. The one I had hidden under my hand. The room camera had not seen it. The computer had never stored it before MBXQ sent it. Only I had known what I intended to transmit, unless intention was itself one of the route points. At 9:50, the camera timestamp skipped backward, not the recording, the timestamp alone. It changed from 9:50:03 to 9:49:54. 8.4 seconds. The room continued normally. The mechanical clock moved forward. My watch moved forward. The camera displayed the room 8.4 seconds behind its actual time. I raised my right hand. On the monitor, my recorded image raised its hand 8 seconds later. That was ordinary delay if viewed alone. But when I lowered my hand, the monitor image lowered its hand before I did. I tested it twice. The relationship was no longer simple. The monitor was not delayed. It was offset, sometimes behind, sometimes ahead. The order depended on whether I had already decided what movement to make. I stopped testing. Every test had become an acknowledgement. Every comparison gave the route another pair of events to connect. I covered the camera lens. The monitor continued showing the room. The image was empty. The chair at the operating position was pushed in. The archive card lay on the desk. The headphones hung from the receiver panel. It showed the room as it would look after I left. The timestamp read 11:51. At 9:52, nearly 2 hours before that displayed time, the empty room on the monitor changed. The paper printer began operating. A strip emerged. The camera view was too distant to read it. Then someone entered the frame. I could only see the lower edge of a coat and one hand. The person sat in the chair. The face remained outside the camera's field of view. The hand reached toward the Morse key. It wore my watch. I removed the watch from my wrist and placed it in the desk drawer. On the monitor, the future hand paused. Then it removed the same watch. The movement occurred before mine was complete. I shut the monitor off. The screen went black. From its speaker, even without power, came the cleanest Morse of the night, the time I had sent the random group. Then, .04 complete. This was no longer a contact attempt. It was a survey. The station had defined 4 points. The first commemorative transmission in 1999, the archived closing message, the physical receiving site, the operator completing the current exchange. The route had gone from a historical broadcast through a repeating schedule into a place and then into a person. A path needs connected points. I had supplied the last 2 myself. At 9:55, I returned to the number groups MBXQ had transmitted earlier. I stopped reading them as dates and positions. I treated each group as a duration from an established reference. When plotted in order, the values expanded by multiples of 8.4 seconds. 8.4, 16.8, 25.2, 33.6, 42. The original call interval had been 42 seconds, then 33, then 24, then 15. The sequence was counting downward through the same interval series. It was not approaching 0 by exact increments because the sent groups consumed time. The available silence between transmissions was collapsing. MBXQ was not growing closer in miles. It was reducing the amount of time separating its transmission from ours. First, it answered 8 seconds early, then 16, then 25. If the sequence continued, it would eventually answer hours before a message, then years. At that point, the historic card made sense. SS Bellwether had not been added to the archive tonight. Tonight was being added to the ship's past. The record looked old because, from the direction in which the route was being completed, it had always been there. The graphite looked fresh because the event writing it had not finished. At 9:58, the card added another line. Departure, 12 July 1999. Destination, 12 July. Current. Cargo, coast traffic. I did not understand the final phrase. A coast station handles traffic from ships. It does not carry coast traffic. The wording suggested the ship was transporting something belonging to a coast, or transporting the coast itself. I examined the Bellwether card under magnification. The vessel dimensions had changed. The length field no longer contained feet or meters. It contained 08-1840, the same duration as the first commemorative transmission window. The tonnage field contained the coordinates of Point Reyes. The vessel was being described using time and station position because those were its physical dimensions. SS Bellwether was not a ship in any conventional sense. The ship identity was an interface, a form the old maritime system could understand. Call sign, traffic list, position report, route, destination. The phenomenon had entered through the procedure available to it. If this had begun at an observatory, it might have appeared as coordinates. If it had begun inside a computer network, it might have appeared as packets and addresses. Here, in a maritime station, it appeared as a vessel requesting contact. The ghost ship was never a ghost. It was a routing instruction wearing the shape of a ship. At 10:02, the grounded receiver produced a carrier. No antenna, no input, no powered oscillator. A pure tone emerged at the headphone jack. I did not put on the headphones. The tone was audible from where they rested against the desk. MBXQ called once. Then it sent, route copied. The phrase was brief. The meaning was clear. Every point required for the route had been acknowledged except one, the sign-off. Night of Nights had opened at NO001 UTC. The historic route ended with a closing transmission. Tonight's scheduled closing message remained in the automatic system. I checked the transmission schedule. Final KPH identification and sign-off were set for 11:59 Pacific. The message had been prepared earlier and transferred to a backup automatic keyer at Bolinas. Under normal conditions, Point Reyes would trigger it remotely. But the transmitter site also had a local timer to ensure the final identification was sent if the control circuit failed. I had helped test that backup. The local timer did not require the Point Reyes control line. Opening the remote circuit would not stop it. I sent the inhibit command. The controller returned accepted. I sent it again. Accepted. The schedule display changed to canceled. For 12 seconds, the entry remained gray. Then it returned. 11:59. Final identification. I canceled it a second time. It returned with an earlier time. 11:58:51. 8.4 seconds earlier. I canceled again. 11:58:34. 16.8 seconds earlier. Each attempt moved the send-off backward through the same sequence. By trying to stop it, I was supplying additional events for the route to connect. I stopped touching the control system. The schedule settled at 11:57:26. The automatic sign-off was now due roughly 2 minutes early. At 10:07, I considered driving to Bolinas. Under good conditions, the trip would take too long. At night, through coastal roads and fog, there was no chance of reaching the transmitter site before the scheduled message. I considered cutting station power entirely. That would not disable equipment at Bolinas. I considered contacting another operator. I did not. This was partly because I could not explain the event without asking someone else to inspect or acknowledge it. But there was another reason. At 10:08, the telephone line displayed an incoming call from the Bolinas control number. There was no voice when I lifted the receiver, only Morse. Not through the telephone speaker, through the small movements of the receiver hook beneath my hand. It tapped my random group, NQ7L4X. Then my initials, then a new time. I returned the handset without answering. At 10:43 and 11 seconds, I knew something would occur. Whether I waited for it or tried to prevent it, the time had already been sent. That made every action feel like cooperation. At 10:12, the archive card showed SS Bellwether's destination changing. Point Reyes became Point Reyes receiving. Then, receiving Point Reyes. The words had reversed their function. Point Reyes was no longer merely the name of a place containing a receiving station. Point Reyes itself was receiving. What it was receiving remained unclear. I went to the west window. The fog had thinned over the ground but remained dense above the coast. No ship lights were visible. No horn. No engine. The night outside looked ordinary except for the horizon. Point Reyes faces open Pacific. From this location, weather and terrain obscure much of the direct waterline, but the western sky should still appear lower and broader than the land. Tonight there was a dark vertical limit inside the fog. At first I thought it was a cloud bank. Then I noticed the stars above it. Stars were visible to a fixed height and then stopped in a line too level to be cloud. I marked the angle against the window frame, 11 degrees above the expected horizon. A bank of fog can produce that appearance. A distant marine layer can make a false horizon. I had no reason to connect it to the signal. Then the grounded receiver sent a weather observation. Not words. Coded groups. Wind direction. Pressure. Visibility. Sea condition. The measurements did not match Point Reyes. Pressure was lower. Visibility was 30 nautical miles. Sea state was calm. The wind came from the geographic west at a speed inconsistent with the movement of trees outside. A final group identified the observation location, Bellwether Reach. No such forecast zone exists on any chart in this station. I entered the pressure value into the paper log. The barometer on the wall began falling toward it. Not instantly, slowly, one division at a time. The cypress branches outside changed direction. They had been moving inland under the evening wind. They turned toward the west, toward the dark line. At 10:18, I opened the metal can containing the tape. The reel was warm. A magnetic tape may retain a recording even when removed from a deck, but it cannot play itself. It cannot update itself. It cannot know what has happened since it was removed. I placed the reel on a hand-turned inspection spindle. I did not connect it to audio equipment. I advanced it manually and examined the surface for damage. At approximately the section corresponding to the original closing message, the oxide had formed narrow bands, not scratches. Bands of different sheen, spaced like a waveform made physical. Under oblique light, the bands formed characters, not printed letters. Morse timing, long bands, short bands, spaces. I copied the pattern. It translated to coast follows route. That was the meaning of cargo, coast traffic. The ship was not moving toward Point Reyes. The route was bringing its coast with it. At 10:23, I reviewed the original Bellwether technical fields again. Its route across the Pacific was listed in familiar port abbreviations, but one port did not exist. The code contained 3 letters that could have belonged to hundreds of historical locations. I compared it with the impossible weather zone name, Bellwether Reach. The same code appeared in the observation header. I searched old charts. No result. I searched current charts. No result. I searched the station's point-to-point route lists. There it was. Not as a maritime port, as a receiving circuit. A circuit that appeared only once in a preliminary schedule dated before the Point Reyes facility opened. The destination column was blank. The bearing was west-southwest. The propagation window was listed as 0001 to 081840. The same time group's MBXQ had transmitted. At the bottom, someone had typed, "Circuit not to be established." No reason. No signature. No operational record showing it had ever been tested. The sheet itself was genuine period paper, but the type used for the warning did not match the rest of the document. It matched the typewriter on the archive desk behind me. I tested one letter on a separate sheet. Same worn E. Same slightly elevated T. The warning had been typed in this room, on that machine, and placed in an archive decades before the typewriter was brought to its current desk. Or it would be. At 10:27, the typewriter carriage moved. One space. I removed the ribbon. It moved again. The keys remained still, but the carriage advanced in Morse intervals. 3 short movements. 1 long. 2 short. The building was no longer using devices for their intended purpose. It was using whatever motion could preserve timing. I carried the typewriter into the storage corridor and closed the door. The wall clock began ticking in irregular groups. I stopped its pendulum. The transformer hum beneath the receiver rack rose and fell. I opened the main breaker. Emergency lighting came on. The hum continued. It was coming from outside. From the antenna field, every suspended wire can vibrate. Wind across a long antenna can produce sound below or near human hearing. Under tension, insulators and support structures can resonate. The tone outside was too organized. Long, short, long, pause. The entire antenna system was sending MBXQ. There was no longer a useful distinction between signal and environment. At 10:34, I began this maintenance recording. The original opening statement on this tape was not my first attempt. I recorded a shorter account at 10:34 and rewound it. My words were present. Behind them, 8.4 seconds earlier on the tape, was a faint copy of the same words. Analog tape can develop print-through. Strongly recorded material on one layer can magnetically impress itself onto adjacent layers, creating a weak pre-echo or post-echo. That normally develops while tape remains wound. It does not appear instantly on fresh tape. Still, it was a known physical phenomenon, and for several minutes I accepted it. I reduced the recording level. I used a fresh reel. The pre-echo remained. Then the earlier voice stopped matching. It spoke words I had not yet recorded. My own voice, faint and incomplete, said, "The date on this recording is July 12. I had not decided to include the date. I listened twice. Then, while attempting to document what I had heard, I spoke the sentence exactly as it existed on the tape. That is why it appears near the beginning of this account. The recording did not predict my words. It trained me to repeat them. The same may have happened when I pressed send at 9:19. MBXQ did not need to see a fixed future. It placed a message in the past, then waited for me to make it correct. Prediction and instruction become indistinguishable when the predicted person can hear the result. At 10:43 and 11 seconds, the time sent through the telephone, the maintenance recorder activated its second track. The control had been set to track 1 only. A faint version of my voice began speaking under the live recording. It was approximately 1 hour and 8 minutes ahead. I heard only 17 seconds before I stopped playback. The future recording described the operations room as empty. It said the final sign-off had transmitted. It said the weather bulletin had returned. Then it said there was a light on the western coast. Not a ship light, a coast light. I do not know what that means. I have not listened to the remaining future audio. Every time I listen to a predicted fragment, I become more likely to repeat it. I am continuing this account without monitoring the second track. If my words begin doubling, the earlier voice may no longer be following me. I may be following it. At 10:49, the carrier tone returned through the disconnected headphones. MBXQ transmitted another position. The coordinates were invalid as latitude and longitude. The north value exceeded 90 degrees. I converted the numbers into time intervals. They pointed to 11:57 and 26 seconds. The revised sign-off time. The final waypoint had been scheduled. The call ended with a traffic count. Not one message, not 10. The group indicated all traffic. In maritime procedure, a coast station might announce traffic waiting for multiple ships. A vessel would request its own messages. MBXQ claimed to be carrying traffic addressed to every coast station that had participated in the route. KPH, KFS, and several old calls no longer active. I will not repeat them. Some belong to preserved stations. Some belong to facilities that no longer exist. One call predates international allocation records available here. The danger is not specific to Point Reyes. Point Reyes is simply the point currently being completed. If another station hears its own old traffic returned before transmission, it must not answer. At 10:54, I found the pattern hidden in the night of night schedule. Each annual opening began at the same commemorative boundary, 1 minute after midnight GMT. The event preserved memory by repeating a time. That repetition created a stable coordinate, not in space, in sequence. For a phenomenon unable to cross ordinary distance, a repeated moment may be as useful as a lighthouse. Every July 12, we lit it again. Every opening message told anything listening that this end of the route still existed. The old call signs were not summoning dead operators. They were providing addresses that time had stopped using, but radio continued to recognize. An abandoned address is still reachable if someone keeps checking the mailbox. At 11:02, the paper printer reconnected itself. I do not mean the cable moved. It remained on the floor. The printer began producing text anyway. The first line was an ordinary marine weather header. The second contained the time 11:57:26. The third contained Point Reyes conditions. Wind had shifted west. Pressure continued falling. Visibility inland remained 4 miles in fog. Visibility west was listed as unlimited. The next line identified Bellwether Reach. The final line read, "Coastal boundary expected before sign-off." I tore off the paper. The next sheet printed the same bulletin with one change. The boundary time moved 8.4 seconds earlier. I stopped tearing sheets. Each physical reaction was becoming part of the count. At 11:07, I checked the west window again. The dark line had risen to 13 degrees. That could indicate a cloud bank moving closer, but the lower edge was too straight. The fog between the station and the line reflected a weak white light at regular intervals. 4 seconds bright, 4 seconds dark. Not a maritime lighthouse characteristic known to me. The light did not sweep. The whole fog bank brightened at once, as though a coastline beyond it were much larger than the curvature of the local horizon allowed. The Morse rhythm in the antenna wires synchronized with the light. Long pulse, short pulse, space. The call sign MBXQ expanded across miles of fog. The station no longer needed to decode it. The coast itself was speaking in the same timing. At 11:12, the Bellwether archive card added a crew count, 1. I expected a list of names. None appeared. The occupation field filled in. Radio operator. The name field remained blank. The card was not describing a drowned sailor. It was preparing a role. A route shaped like a vessel requires a sender, receiver, destination, and operator. It had created the first 3 from station history. The remaining blank was waiting for the person who completed the sign-off. I moved the card away from the keying desk. The crew count changed to 0. I carried it closer. 1. I stepped away. 0. The card did not identify me as a crew member because of my name. It identified the operating position as part of the vessel. The chair, key, and person seated there formed the missing operator. That is why the camera showed my watch. The future image was not predicting that I would return to the desk. It was displaying the configuration required to finish the route. At 11:18, I removed the Morse key from the desk and locked it in the metal cabinet. The transmitter at Bolinas did not require that key for automatic sign-off, but the local operating position did. If the route needed symbolic completion as well as RF transmission, removing the key might deny it an operator. The archive card's crew count remained 0. For 9 minutes, no new text appeared. The western light stopped. The dark horizon held at 13 degrees. The sign-off schedule remained 11:57:26. I believed I had found a second containment point. Not the tape. The operating role. A station is more than equipment. Procedure assigns meaning to action. A key on a desk means someone can transmit. A call sign means someone can be called. A chair facing a receiver means someone is keeping watch. Remove the key and the system loses one piece of that meaning. At 11:27, the building's fire alarm test switch began clicking. The alarm did not sound. The switch moved in Morse. K. Invitation to transmit. Then the telephone hook. K. Then the printer carriage. K. Then the relay rack. K. Every mechanism in the building offered the same invitation. I did not answer. At 11:31, the west light returned. This time it did not match MBXQ. It matched KPH. The coast was calling the station by name. The route no longer needed the original key. Any controlled interval could serve. Any action from me could become acknowledgement if repeated at the correct time. I stopped moving. The room continued. Emergency lights flickered. The clock ticked. Fog struck the window. The building generated thousands of accidental intervals. Most were meaningless. But the anomaly had spent hours learning which rhythms we treated as language. It no longer required intentional Morse. It required recognition. If I understood a pattern as KPH, then KPH had been called. If I reacted, the call had been answered. This is the information hazard at the center of the event. You cannot safely monitor MBXQ by decoding it. Decoding creates the relationship it needs. A signal becomes a message only when a receiver assigns meaning. The route is built from that assignment. At 11:36, I stopped translating the sounds. I heard clicks, but refused to count them. I watched the western flashes but did not identify their lengths. I turned the operations clock face toward the wall. I covered every display showing seconds. The station became a room of unmeasured noise. For almost 10 minutes, the anomaly weakened. The horizon line lowered. Pressure stabilized. The archive card remained unchanged. This suggests the route cannot complete itself through raw energy alone. It needs an observer capable of recognizing sequence. It needs an operator. At 11:46, the maintenance tape spoke from the second track. I had not started playback. My future voice emerged beneath the room tone. It said one sentence. You have already measured the silence. I looked at the clock before I could stop myself. The silence had lasted 9 minutes and 34 seconds. By checking, I gave it a duration. The printer struck once. The western horizon flashed. The sign-off schedule moved to 11:56:17. The route had used my period of non-observation as another measured interval. There was no safe withdrawal while I remained in the station. Listening was acknowledgement. Silence was acknowledgement once measured. Refusal was acknowledgement if it occurred in response to a call. The only possible defense was to leave without marking the time. I took my coat. I removed my watch from the drawer and left it there. I did not look at the operations clock. I walked toward the exit. The emergency light above the door blinked 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. The first conventional distress signal of the entire event. I stopped. That was deliberate. A ghost ship story is expected to contain an SOS. Anyone trained around maritime radio will react to it. Even knowing the system was manipulating recognition, I stopped, because distress procedure had been built into the reflexes of every person who had worked at a station like this. The signal used duty as a restraint. Then the archive printer produced a single line. SOS origin, KPH. The distress did not come from Bellwether. It came from this station at a later point on the route. If I left, I might be abandoning a real future transmission. If I stayed, I might cause it. That uncertainty held me longer than any locked door could have. At 11:49, I returned to the operations room. The archive card crew count changed from 0 to 1. The key remained locked away. The camera monitor turned on. It showed the empty room at 11:51, the image I had seen earlier. The chair was pushed in. The paper printer operated. A hand entered the frame wearing my watch, but my watch was still in the drawer. The future image opened the drawer and removed it. The hand placed the watch on the desk. Then it reached toward the locked cabinet. The cabinet door opened. The key returned to the operating position. I looked at the actual cabinet, still locked. On the monitor, the seated figure lowered its hand onto the key. The image froze before the first movement. The timestamp read 11:57:26, the sign-off moment. I turned the monitor away. I did not switch it off. The future is most dangerous here when observed and resisted. Every attempt to prevent a displayed action gives that action structure. Instead, I unlocked the cabinet myself. I removed the key. I did not place it on the desk. I carried it to the far side of the room and held it. The archive card crew count remained 1. The root did not care where the key was. The operator had accepted it. At 11:52, MBXQ returned through every headphone in the room. The signal was strong enough to hear without wearing them. It sent no call sign, no position, no service group. Only 3 procedural words: route copied, coast following, stand by. I am now approaching the portion of this account that exists faintly on the second track ahead of my live voice. I can hear it under me. The pre-echo is no longer 8 seconds early. It is approximately 42 seconds early, the full original call interval. That means the negative delay has continued increasing even without deliberate transmission. If it reaches the sign-off duration, this entire recording may exist at the receiving end before I finish it here. Someone may be hearing the warning before I speak it. If that is you, do not send confirmation. Do not contact the station using the call sign in this recording. Do not translate any Morse beneath my voice. Treat it as unstructured noise. At 11:54, the Bolinas controller changed status. The final identification sequence armed. The inhibit command still displayed accepted. The remote line remained open. No command from Point Reyes should have reached the transmitter. The RF monitor showed no carrier. Yet the paper printer began copying KPH's closing message. It printed the first word 51 seconds before the scheduled transmitter sequence. The message was arriving from MBXQ before Bolinas sent it. Not a response this time. The complete closing transmission. The route had obtained the final sign-off from the future and was returning it to the station that would create it. The loop no longer depended on whether Bolinas transmitted. The received copy was enough to place the closing message in the present. If I allowed the automatic decoder to interpret the final station sign-off, the route would regard it as completed. I disconnected the printer physically from its paper supply. The printhead continued striking the metal roller. The letters could still be heard mechanically. I covered my ears. The Morse emerged through the floor. I could feel the long and short intervals through the soles of my shoes. A transmission can be blocked as sound. It cannot be blocked as recognized timing once the receiver is the person standing inside it. At 11:55, the pressure dropped sharply. The west windows flexed inward, not from an impact, from a sustained pressure difference. The fog outside cleared in a straight line from the antenna field to the western horizon. For less than 3 seconds, I saw beyond it. There was no ship. There was water. Beyond the water was a coast. A vertical black coast extending north and south farther than I could see. Its cliffs reflected no station light. Above them stood a line of white points, each flashing a different maritime characteristic. There were too many to be lighthouses. They rose in rows up the cliff face and continued into the low clouds. The arrangement resembled windows viewed at impossible distance, or stars positioned below the horizon. The coast was not approaching across our Pacific. Our Pacific was being placed beside it. The route joined 2 receiving points, a station on our shore, a shore on the other side. SS Bellwether was the name given to the narrow overlap between them. The ship did not carry the coast. The ship was the crossing. At 11:56, the impossible coast disappeared behind fog. The printer completed the copied sign-off. The route was missing only the scheduled RF transmission from Bolinas. The controller displayed 40 seconds. I held the Morse key but did not touch it. The archive card added a name to the blank crew field. It was not mine. It read KPH. The station itself was the operator. I had misunderstood the personal stake. The route did not need to take me. It needed me only long enough to teach an empty station how to recognize and answer. The camera's future room was empty because it no longer required a person. The key on the desk moved in the monitor image. No hand touched it. The scheduled counter reached 20 seconds. The future voice beneath mine stopped speaking. For the first time since I began this account, I was ahead of the recording. I had reached a point it did not contain. That may mean the outcome is not fixed. Or it may mean there was never a recording beyond this moment. 10 seconds. The Bolinas status showed transmitter ready. The Point Reyes RF monitor remained dark. 5, 4, 3. The fire alarm switch clicked K. 2. The western fog turned white. 1. The Bolinas transmitter did not key. The RF monitor remained dark. The controller displayed canceled. For 6 seconds, nothing happened. Then MBXQ sent the KPH closing identification anyway. It sent it in my keying rhythm. The route accepted its own returned copy. No physical transmission was required. The loop contained both message and acknowledgement. At 11:57 and 34 seconds, the archive card changed for the last time. SS Bellwether. Call sign MBXQ. Departure, Bellwether Reach. Destination, Point Reyes. Status, arrived. The vessel dimensions, tonnage, and crew fields disappeared. Only the word arrived remained. The western light went out. The carrier stopped. The building became silent. At 11:58, station power returned without the breaker closing. The receivers illuminated one by one. The printer advanced fresh paper. The clock turned back toward the room. Every system appeared normal. A standard marine weather bulletin began arriving on the working channel. No Morse. Ordinary radio teletype. The header used a familiar regional format. The timestamp was current. Conditions for the California coastal waters appeared normal. Northwest winds, coastal fog, moderate seas. Then the bulletin continued beyond the established forecast zones. It listed Bellwether Reach. It described a coastline approximately 200 nautical miles west of Point Reyes. The coordinates fall in open Pacific on every chart available here. The bulletin includes harbors, navigation lights, shoal water, a coastal radio station. Its call sign is KPH, the same as ours. Its transmission schedule begins 1 minute after ours ends. The final line is not a warning. It is a routine visibility report. I will read it once because it is already present on this recording, and because anyone navigating west of Point Reyes tonight may need to understand what they are seeing. Bellwether Reach, inner coastal waters. Fog clearing from east to west. Visibility unrestricted near the boundary. Uncharted coast becoming visible before dawn. Maintain watch for reciprocal traffic. It is now 12:03. The normal station clock and my battery watch agree. The mechanical log shows no transmission from Bolinas at the scheduled closing time. The paper archive shows one completed contact. KPH with MBXQ. Duration 27 years, 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The coast outside is no longer visible through the fog, but the weather receiver continues listing it. The pressure is holding. The cypress branches have turned inland again. Everything appears ordinary except for one measurement. The Point Reyes shoreline is where it was before. The coordinates of this building have not changed. The stars above the Pacific remain correct. But the receiver now requires less time to hear stations to the west. Signals from Hawaii are arriving early by a fraction too small for ordinary equipment to resolve. A station farther across the Pacific has reported its own echo. I will not identify it. The echo arrived before its carrier. If this effect continues, the route is still expanding. Not toward us. Through us. I am leaving the maintenance tape running in this room. I will not sign off with the station call. I will not provide a closing time. I will not complete another sequence. If you hear Morse after my voice ends, do not count the intervals. Do not search for the call sign. Do not answer a ship named Bellwether. And if tomorrow's marine forecast includes a coast west of Point Reyes, do not assume the chart is outdated. The chart may still be correct. It may be our ocean that has begun receiving something else.